Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. And we will be recording. We are recording, and we'll post this on YouTube afterwards. And with that, I would like to welcome our guest of honor this evening, Congressman David Cicilline from Congressional District Number 1. And we're so happy to have you. Thanks for your time tonight.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. Do you want to take a couple minutes and just give us an overview of what you're up to, and then we can we've shared with you this list of questions that the people online have submitted, and we
Sure.
can take those. Oh.
Sure. So thank you for having me, and thank you for all the good work you're doing, Representative Cordovan. I just want to say that I think we've had an incredibly productive early few months of the Biden administration. I was just putting together a list. In the first 50 or 60 days, we've passed the National Apprenticeship Act, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act was reauthorized. We passed HR 1, the For the People Act. We passed the Equality Act, HR 5. We passed universal background checks and legislation to close the Charleston loophole. We passed the PRO Act to make it easier for folks to organize a union, form a union, and collectively bargain. We passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We passed the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. We reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act. We extended the date by which the Equal Rights Amendment needs to be ratified. And I'm sure I'm forgetting a few, but those are just some of the highlights. I said to the speaker the other day, do you have a plan for the next 21 months? Because I feel like we've done everything in the first 3. And obviously the most important that I didn't mention is the American Rescue Plan. And so, I think we've gotten a lot done. We're now working on an infrastructure bill with the administration that I think is going to be really important to Rhode Island and to our country to rebuild the crumbling infrastructure. And it has investments in traditional things like roads and bridges and public transit and ports and Amtrak, but it also has a significant investment of what the administration is calling infrastructure at home. That is home construction, schools, broadband, drinking water, sewers, modernizing the VA facilities, and community colleges, and then a significant investment in the care economy for those taking care of seniors and people with disabilities, a tremendous investment in research and development, manufacturing and job training. So it's really not just an infrastructure bill, it's really called the American Jobs Act. It's a bill to really invest in getting people back to work at the same time that we're rebuilding the crumbling infrastructure of our country. So there's a lot of work ahead, but I think, the Biden administration has gotten off to a really good start. And the American Rescue Plan, which we worked really hard to ensure address both the pandemic, and that is crush the virus by dramatically increasing vaccine production and vaccine distribution and contact tracing and testing, but also dealing with the economic consequences in a serious way with direct cash payments to families, rental and mortgage assistance, a new fund specifically for restaurants and bars who've been particularly hard hit, additional help for small businesses, a tremendous investment in childcare that will bring half the children in America who live in poverty out of poverty, significant resources for, I might have said rental and mortgage assistance. So, it's a economic development package that I think really does address the gravity of the crisis we're facing. That was the rescue package. And now it's really about the rebuilding the economy, as the president says, so that it works for everyone. And we're building back that economy in a better, kind of more responsible way, and not so that only the people at the very top will benefit. So it's an exciting time, lots of good work. And obviously, Terri, happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Thank you. What you have been so busy. I just want to recognize my colleague in the House, Rep. Speakman's with us. And Rep. Speakman, that list now it makes me feel like we have a lot of catching up to do. in the house.
No,
But we
you know,
have
the
it, we're in a
combination of
different
you,
lane,
Terry, and
yes.
June, I have no doubt you are getting a lot of
Thank
work done.
So, thanks for that long list. So some of the questions are revolved around some of the things that you touched on, but maybe we could go a little bit deeper. So the first one, ask about ventilation in schools. And I think this comes from Louisa Boatwright, who's with us, who's from the school committee. Actually, this comes from Susan McDonald, who is a private school operator, but Louisa Boatwright from Newport School Committee is probably interested in this topic as well. So
yeah, so the
that
American
work?
Rescue Plan includes $122 billion for secondary school emergency relief fund, elementary and secondary school relief fund. Rhode Island is estimated to receive a little over $450 million through ESSER. RIDE will receive the funding. They're required to sub-award 90% of the funds to local education agencies. LEAs are required to use 20% of their allocation to address learning loss, but will have more flexibility in the use of the remaining funds, and updating ventilation is a permissible use of those funds. With respect to the question about non-public schools, the American Rescue Plan also included $2.75 billion for the Emergency Assistance to Non-Public Schools program. Rhode Island is estimated to receive about $5.1 million through this program. The funds will be allocated to states based on their proportional share of children ages 5 to 17 from families with income at or below 185% of poverty. These funds then can be used by the SEAs to provide services or assistance to non-public schools that enroll a significant percentage of low-income students and are most impacted by the coronavirus disease. And those funds can be used to address educational disruptions resulting from COVID-19, PPE, technology, equipment, and reimbursement for the expenses of certain services or assistance that the non-public school incurred after the date of the national emergency declaration related to the coronavirus was made.
So for somebody that is involved in a non-public school, who do they contact?
The state, Rhode Island Department of Education will get that money,
Okay.
the emergency assistance to non-public schools that they will be required to
Okay.
administer.
So that is going to go through RIDE. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. What other kinds of projects will the COVID funding be able to, what will cities and towns be able to use funding for?
So the American Rescue Plan, you know, we fought really, really hard to ensure that part of the the American Rescue Plan included direct aid to states and, very importantly, cities and towns. And, you know, I've been meeting with every single city and town to talk about kind of what money is available or what will be made available to them. The total for the state of Rhode Island is $1.9 billion, 1.1 that will go directly to the state. The balance of it will go to local governments. The money that goes to local governments, and we fought really hard that it go to every city and town regardless of size. And so every single community is getting an allocation. I also fought particularly hard to make sure that the county money, and there's a substantial amount of county money, didn't go to the state, which a lot of states tried to argue. The states that don't have counties said, give us the money. I said, no, the county money should go to the cities and towns in that county. And so I was successful in that. And so there's every single city and town gets an additional allotment based on what percentage of population they have in that county. The general uses for this that are set forth in the legislation are the money can be used to respond to the pandemic or its negative economic impacts, including assistance to households, small businesses, and nonprofits, or aid to impacted industries such as travel, tourism, and hospitality. It can also be used for premium pay to eligible workers performing essential work. It can be used for the provision of government services to the extent that the reduction in revenue was due to the pandemic. And we think all that's going to be required is for a city and town to certify that they had some reduction in revenue. It's not a dollar for dollar match. And then finally, it can be used to make necessary investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. We have spoken directly to the Treasury Department and urged them, because they'll issue the final guidance, that they be very flexible in the use of these funds and seriously consider expanding the infrastructure to go beyond water, sewer, and broadband, because there are a lot of infrastructure projects that will create good paying jobs and that have been impacted by COVID. So hopefully they'll provide more flexibility. But those are the kind of principal reasons, the principal uses for it, and the Treasury Department will issue specific guidance. And as soon as we get that, we'll obviously get it out to all the cities and towns.
So say, for instance, the town of Portsmouth was interested in doing something with broadband, we need to wait for that guidance to come out and.
Well, broadband is in the statute, so you could
Okay.
actually do that immediately. But if you wanted specific guidance, I know there's been some conversations on Quitting Island about kind of doing a sort of collaborative approach with a number of communities, taking a portion of their recovery funds and doing broadband. This broadband commitment was a consequence of kind of the pandemic revealing what we all knew, but the incredible inequities that exist that make it much more difficult for some folks to work remotely, some young people to go to school remotely, and making sure we make the kind of investments in broadband, which is why the president also included a huge investment in broadband in his infrastructure bill that will produce, more than, to deliver broadband to more than 35% of rural Americans who currently lack access to it, as an example.
So there's some money in the American Rescue Plan, but then there would be more money if an infrastructure bill comes to fruition.
When an infrastructure bill comes.
Okay, I love that. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, when. That's right. All right, we'll go with that. So another question on this same line of thinking is there any possibility of federal internships being in person as a benefit of the rescue plan? Do you have any details exactly on that?
I mean, I think, there's obviously a tremendous interest in in-person internships. I know just from my own office's experiences, how different internships are when they're done virtually. It's not as great for us. It's not as great for people doing internships. I think that's especially the case in science-based settings. And so, I think it's even more difficult to have interns working remotely. I think there's a real effort underway within the federal government to make sure that people who are going to work in person are vaccinated, and so that vaccination process is proceeding as quickly as possible. We've reached out to NOAA specifically to request information from them on the timeline for when they expect in-person internships will resume. And the minute that we will get that, we'll get it to you, Terry, to get to whichever constituent has raised it as soon as we get that answer.
Great. I think I have a hand raised from Lynn Katzman from our Portsmouth Town Committee.
Lynn, you have to show yourself. We don't there you go.
How are you all? Thank you so much for coming out to Terry's one of Terry's talks. Appreciate it. I've been reading a lot about the infrastructure plan and what's proposed, and the messaging that's going on around it. And I know you've been involved in messaging on lots of issues in past years. One of the things that struck me in researching infrastructure in the United States is Eisenhower's famous federal highway bill was marketed as a matter of national security and to support defense, and from simple things like moving troops from one place to another, it was necessary. I don't think there's a facet of the current infrastructure proposal that doesn't have a national security justification behind it. And so I'm wondering if there's any plans to make it more difficult to say no to it by making it, what, you don't support our military?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's a polling done just last week that shows 73% of Americans support the infrastructure plan, including a clear majority of Republicans. So I don't know how much work we have to do to convince people. this is pretty bipartisan and pretty much
Yeah, it isn't.
supported by a broad cross-section of the American people. I don't know very many pieces of
It
legislation.
isn't the people. It isn't the people of
Let me
America
just
you
finish,
have to
Len.
convince.
Let me just finish.
Sure.
So, I think the only place it remains kind of controversial is within the Republican cloakroom in
Right.
Washington, not in the country. And so, I think you raise a really good point. I think that will have some resonance with some Republicans, but I will report to you that sadly, I think the Republicans have made it their position, and I think Mitch McConnell would admit this, that they don't intend on working with Democrats to pass anything, that their objective is to stop Joe Biden from enacting any legislation successfully so that they will have the ability to go to the voters 2 years from now and say, see, you gave Democrats the House, the Senate, and the White House, and they've done nothing to improve your life. It's time to give us a chance. I mean, they've been explicit about that game plan. So I think we should work hard to try to continue to get them in it and to create a framework like based on national security where they will be responsible if they don't support it. But I have to confess, I don't have a lot of confidence that whatever the arguments are, that they are going to change their minds, because I think they're thinking about trying to take the House back, and they're in a stronger position to do that if nothing happens. That's their whole kind of argument. But it's a good point, and I will share it with my colleagues.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. So follow up to that, John Brooks, I think, is with us this evening, and he sent a couple of questions on the infrastructure bill. Who will select the priority of the projects, and would that be state or federal? And what's the vetting process of that?
Well, I mean, depending on what's in the final bill, this is really a framework from the president. There's not an actual bill yet, but I expect that there will be resources that will go to projects that are, the responsibility of the federal government to actually build, whether it be through the people who maintain the hurricane barrier. Engineer the. Will come to me. Anyway, there are a series of infrastructure projects that will be the federal government. Amtrak is one, for example. There will be resources that will go to states that it will be administered by the State Department of Transportation. And then my hope is, and what I'll fight hard for, Army Corps of Engineers is what Annie is reminding me. Thank you, Annie. There will be projects, I hope that resources will go directly to the local municipalities, cities, and towns, because I do think, giving resources directly to cities and towns that have infrastructure projects would be one of the fastest ways to get money out and get projects going. That will be a determination that's made, during the negotiations, but I'm going to fight hard to make sure that resources go both to the federal level, to the state level, and to the local level.
Oh, that'd be great, because people have been asking me if we'll be able to finally pave East Main Road.
Yeah.
and I guess that'll be to be determined.
Yeah, I mean, in the plan, just so you know, the Biden proposal will invest $115 billion to improve roadways, and they expect that will provide. I'm trying to remember the length, but it's a huge investment. And in addition to that, they've also added $20 billion to improve road safety, including for cyclists and pedestrians. So there's a significant investment. And they say in their proposal, they would establish $174 billion in a grant and incentive program for state and local governments to build a national network of 500,000 electric vehicle chargers. So there's at least some expectation about resources going directly to the state and local governments. So that's a good sign.
So what about, while we're talking about environmental pieces, how does green energy fit into this? And I got a question in the chat from Louisa on school net funding for net zero carbon, I guess, in school. And Louisa, if you want to jump in on that question.
Yeah, I'd love to, because as you guys all know, we have a school bond passed in Newport. Both Pell is an addition, which was actually, we've learned, built net zero, but they didn't implement any of the net zero capabilities because they didn't have the money through RIDE. And I'm fairly frightened that's going to be the case with Rogers. So I know the infrastructure bill And also you just talked about the American Rescue Plan, that there's money for infrastructure. But we, we're working with Don Oyer and Lauren Carson, but at your level, these are things that if you implement the green technology, actually down the road, you get net savings in utilities costs and so on. So I used to volunteer at US Green Buildings, and we were seeking back then, it's almost like a revolving loan program. And I'm hoping you guys consider that in the infrastructure bill, and even somehow now giving RIDE the ability to do that for like new buildings and old buildings to ensure there is money to make them green and reduce our carbon footprint. Has that been discussed?
Yes, so you should know that there's a significant investment in at least the framework that the president has put forth. His plan includes providing $16 billion to clean up abandoned mines and gas wells, extending the renewable energy production and investments tax credits for 10 years, creating 10 carbon capture systems at former industrial facilities, expanding the tax credit for carbon capture, providing $10 billion to create a civilian climate corps, ending tax preferences for the oil and gas industry. And his plan also calls for $50 billion to improve resilience to climate change, include by protecting electric grid, food systems, urban infrastructure, and hospitals in communities where that are most vulnerable to flooding, which we have a lot in our state, and other severe weather events. The infrastructure overhaul would also cover protection from wildfires, sea level rise, hurricanes, and droughts. And the plan would put $35 billion toward clean energy technology, new methods for reducing emissions, and other broad-based climate research, and would establish an energy efficiency and clean electricity standard that would set specific targets to cut how much gas and coal-fired electricity power plant companies can use over time. So those are what are included in the framework. We're going to fight hard to be sure a big part of the investment is made on resiliency, sustainability, addressing climate, building, infrastructure that will last for generations, because we've taken into account all of those things.
That's great. So,
is there a way to reach out to who on your staff would we work with? I'm just curious to try to loop in on that.
Well, you work with my DC staff. Megan Garcia is my legislative director. Just so you know, the bill has not been written yet. So if you're interested in what does the bill say, we don't have it yet. If you're interested in helping to shape it with ideas, you should do that now while it's being developed. And in either case, Megan Garcia is the person in my DC office who handles legislation.
Thank you.
Great.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay. Staying on the topic of infrastructure, we've had, sadly, several recent suicides from people jumping off two off the Newport Bridge and one off the Jamestown Bridge. There's a bill in the State House chamber to put up netting to, protective against suicide jumpers. Is there anything in the infrastructure bill or the American Rescue Plan that would assist with that?
Yeah, I think, the netting obviously would be valuable and useful. And I think there's obviously an enormous amount of money in the American Rescue Plan that goes to the state and cities and towns to provide resources to do netting. So I don't think that should be an issue. I do think the question raises a much more profound problem. And I think that is that we haven't begun to even begin to appreciate the very serious mental health consequences of this pandemic and the isolation and the very difficult time for everyone, but particularly for those struggling with some mental health issues. And so we included in the American Rescue Plan a down payment on that, $3.8 billion for mental health and substance use treatment, and $7.8 billion for community health centers as an important beginning, as well as $150 million for the Child Care Development Block Grant, which can also provide mental health services for adolescents. So we've begun that, but I think we have to be prepared as a country to recognize that there's going to be enormous mental health costs related to this pandemic. And we've just begun to understand that, and making sure that, states and localities have the resources to provide those services is going to be really critical.
Thank you.
It's also a good time to remind people, if you have a neighbor or family member that you maybe are not in regular contact with, it's a great moment to reach out to them and just check on them and ask how they're doing. And family members that maybe you don't talk to a lot, to just reach out to them. This has been a hard time for everyone. And I just think we, as much as we can just sort of take it upon ourselves to check with those around us. And obviously if anyone is having their own issues, reach out for help, because there's a lot of help.
Yeah, that's a very important reminder, and you're right about that. And thanks for your efforts on that. Moving on to a new topic, voting. A lot of people asked me for a report out on HR 1. What do you think?
We passed HR 1. We gave it the number 1 because we all understand in the Democratic caucus that it's the most important bill we've passed. It impacts everything else, our ability to get legislation enacted that will reduce the cost of prescription drugs, or that will enact sensible gun policy, or that will enact responsible environmental policy. All of that is impacted by the corrupting influence of money in our political system. HR 1 protects the most important thing we have in our democracy, and that is the right of people to vote and have their voices heard. It's a fundamental building block of our democracy. HR 1 not only makes it easier for people to vote, it includes automatic voter registration, which is my bill. It includes the Disclose Act, which Sheldon and I introduced together to reveal the dark money that exists in our system. It makes it easier for people to vote with, vote by mail, extended voting hours, all the things that would make it easier for people to vote. It raises ethical standards, brings greater transparency. It is, in my view, and I think the view of most people who have read it, the most important pro-democracy bill passed by Congress in a generation. And sadly, while we passed HR 1, our Republican colleagues around the country have been engaged in the most overt act of political cheating that you've ever seen in your life, by making it harder for people to vote. Like legislation that makes it harder for people who have a right to vote, who have a legal right to vote, to be able to vote, like they did in Georgia. That's just cheating. That's just not wanting people to vote so you can win elections that you've lost in the past because you're a sore loser. Everyone talks about voter suppression. That's a fancy word. It's cheating, plain and simple. It's political cheating. And that's what the Republicans are doing in 46 states. So while we've passed HR 1 to protect our democracy, they're engaged in an active campaign to make it harder for people to vote, especially in communities of color and for poor people, so that people who traditionally don't vote for them will have a harder time voting. It is really egregious. It has been successful already in some states. The only way we can thwart that is to pass HR 1. And my view is the Senate has to figure out a way to pass HR 1, because it cannot be the case that the Senate, which is already a fundamentally undemocratic institution, made more undemocratic by the filibuster, that undemocratic artifice is going to be the reason that we don't pass a bill to protect our democracy. I mean, that just can't be. And so there's been some discussion about, do they get rid of the filibuster? Do they have a carve out and say, on issues of democracy, voting rights, and civil rights, you can't invoke the filibuster and carve out some exception, but something has to happen to ensure that HR 1 becomes the law of the land, and the Republicans have a responsibility to do that.
And this all sits on one person's lap right now, right? In the Senate?
One or two.
Senator Manchin, one or two?
Senator Sinema a little bit, but yeah, Manchin more so.
Wow.
And I don't know if anyone saw Jonathan K. party today. He had this great example of a kid going into a a stall or a barn, and there's just piles and piles and piles of manure. And the kid, starts digging, and they're like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "If there's this much manure, there must be a pony nearby." And Jonathan Capehart was saying, like, this is what Senator Manchin is like, this idea of like, oh, there is bipartisanship, you just have to keep looking for it. It's like, no, it just, unfortunately, it doesn't exist. And I think I applaud them for trying. And I think, Senator Manchin needs a little bit of time to kind of come to this realization. Great. But, look, we've watched this. They have no interest in a piece of legislation that's going to protect the right to vote. These are the same people in the House who voted not to certify the election after a bloody insurrection in the Capitol. The notion that they somehow care about expanding voting rights is just not the case. And so I just, we have to keep the pressure on. We're going to pass a lot. We've already passed a lot of good bills. We're going to pass a lot more. For 4 years, we complained that they went to the Senate and they died in Mitch McConnell's graveyard. And he called himself the Grim Reaper. He was proud of that. It cannot be the case that we pass bills and they now die in Chuck Schumer's graveyard. And, if anyone thinks that we can go to voters 2 years from now and say, oh, I know we didn't get anything done and we didn't, none of this became law, but, there's this thing called cloture and we need 60 votes and there's no, the American people worked hard to give us the majority in the House, the Senate, and the White House. They expect us to deliver. And, they're right. And we have to do, in my view, whatever it is, use whatever lever of power we have to deliver for the American people, or we don't deserve to be in the party in the majority. And, the Republicans wouldn't hesitate to do the opposite. We know that because they got rid of the filibuster to jam through their Supreme Court nominees. So, this is not something we have to wonder about. I'm not a senator, so I don't have any say over it, but I'm fighting hard to say, it can't be that all these good bills that we're passing are just going to sit there and the Republicans are going to prevent their enactment. That just is dead wrong, in my view.
I got a personal question. Were you in the chamber on January 6th?
No, I was in my office in the Rayburn office building.
It must have been a scary day.
Yeah, it was very scary for many of my colleagues who were on the floor. I was really lucky that I was in my office.
Thank you. A couple people have asked about holding your Republican colleagues accountable for what happened on January 6th. Do you all talk about that?
Yes, the speaker has articulated her intention to create a 9/11 style commission so that we can really understand all the circumstances surrounding the insurrection and be sure that not only we know all the facts, but anyone who participated in any way is held fully accountable. There's obviously an ongoing criminal investigation by the Department of Justice, but the challenge to the 9/11 Commission, unfortunately, has been, in order to be effective, it really has to be bipartisan. And the Republicans have signaled that actually they don't think we need a commission they don't want a commission that's limited to the events of January 6th. They want to turn it into a commission that looks at all violence and violence committed by Black Lives Matter and violence committed by protests in Wisconsin. It's just make it a circus, basically. And so the struggle right now is how do you move forward in a serious way with a bipartisan commission and agree on the scope of it, which ought to be the events surrounding January 6th and nothing else, without allowing the Republicans to turn it into, just a circus. And so that's kind of the problem right now. There are a number of ethics investigations underway that might implicate some of these folks, but we need a full 9/11 style commission for sure.
A couple people want to know about Matt Gaetz.
I think Matt Gaetz is in a lot of trouble. There's an open ethics investigation now and an open Department of Justice investigation. And if you believe the reporting, his co-conspirator is now cooperating with the federal government. So I think this is very likely not to end very well for Mr. Gaetz, and you will see him either resign or be removed from Congress.
And I guess we just have to wait for the Department of Justice they're in control of that timeline.
Yes, and the ethics committee, but they move pretty quickly.
Okay, so the ethics committee could,
Yes,
could take action? Okay,
absolutely.
okay. Going back to voting for a minute, you mentioned what all the other states were doing to curb, not all the other states, but a number of states to curb voting. In Rhode Island, we have a bill in both chambers that would take the voting practices that we did in the pandemic and enshrine them in state law. I mean, they're already there, but I think the signatures, getting rid of the 2 signatures required for an absentee ballot, and to allow the Secretary of State to send out the mail ballot request forms, and I think to change the wording from emergency voting to early voting. Do you supportive of all that, I imagine? As a
Yes,
Rhode
I'm
Islander?
supportive of anything that makes it easier for people to vote. I mean, voting is the way that the people in Rhode Island and in this country have power. It's their voice. The idea that you have to take time out of work or stand in a long line or go through some other process to vote is just, to me, totally nonsensical. And it's one of the reasons lots of people don't vote. And so I think we should be doing everything we can to make it easier for people to vote so that more people can have their voices heard and there's more power vested in the people of this state and the people of our country. And there are some great examples around the country where states have much higher voter participation rates. We ought to look at those and just make it as easy as humanly possible to vote in this country.
I personally agree with that. I would imagine most people on the call this evening agree with that too. I have in the text, I have a question about how are things going in the Antitrust Committee for you? It's been a busy committee.
Yeah, great. So for people who might not be aware, the Antitrust Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee I chair, and we conducted in the last Congress the first antitrust investigation done by Congress in 50 years. I announced the major investigation of the digital marketplace, the large technology platforms. We conducted a 16-month investigation. We issued a 500-page report. It was fully bipartisan, which is very unusual, but I really made an effort to make it so. And we uncovered that these are 4 technology platforms: Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Apple are essentially monopolies or have monopoly power. They are using that power to discriminate against competitors, to disadvantage consumers, to favor their own products and services. And it has produced, an absence of competition in the digital marketplace. We are now drafting legislation in response to that report. The first bills will actually be introduced in the next few weeks. There will probably be close to a dozen bills by the time we're done, and they will, most of them will be bipartisan, which is great, and they will restore competition into the digital marketplace, deal with some of the issues of privacy and the misuse of information as well, and I think it's going to be great. And my Republican ranking member, which means the highest ranking member of the subcommittee, is a guy named Ken Buck from Colorado. He and I don't agree on anything, including maybe what the day of the week is, but the one area we agree on is antitrust. And he has said publicly that this is the most bipartisan work he's ever done in Congress, which is great, because we're going to need that to get through the Senate.
Will you have legislation so that when you buy a new phone that some of the pre-installed applications may or may not be on that phone anymore?
Yes, there's a Department of Justice investigation of that issue right now. And the president has appointed very good people. We're waiting for his appointment of the Antitrust Division at the Department of Justice, but he appointed Lita Khan, who was actually one of the key investigators who worked for me in the last Congress to do this report. She's going to be now at the FTC. He appointed Tim Wu to his economic council. So the Department of Justice, I think, is going to be very robust in this enforcement in this area, and a great partner in the work we're going to do in Congress on that to address the issue you mentioned and many, many others.
That's good. We've seen some legislation at the state level, but it does seem to me more like a federal issue.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you're working on that. That's great. Just looking to see if I think we've touched on, here's a question. This was interesting. What's being done to strengthen the IRS to capture lost revenue? What happened to the IRS, say, maybe take us back over the last 4 years or so?
Yeah, I mean, the IRS, like a lot of the federal agencies, but particularly the IRS, because you might remember the Republican attack on the IRS in its investigations. I mean, it's been really gutted. And like so many of the departments of the federal government, the leaders of these agencies are having to really rebuild, whether it's the State Department, the Department of Education, the IRS. So, I think you'll see a significant investment so the IRS can kind of rebuild itself, but it's been gutted by, cuts in funding, elimination of positions, mostly so they couldn't do their job.
Have you seen that affect tax collections? Are there...
Absolutely. And audits,
right,
and criminal investigations, and all the other civil investigations as well.
Right. So all these plans, that's funding that supports many of the
Absolutely.
things that we're talking about tonight.
Yeah.
So
you might remember we had a president who allegedly paid $750 in taxes. So he wasn't a big fan of the IRS.
right. Yes. I was just leaving that out respectfully.
Yeah.
What about Washington, D.C.? Any chance that will become a state in the next under the Biden administration?
I've been a co-sponsor of that bill since I got to Congress. I think we will vote on it. I think it's HR 51 this session in the next couple of weeks. Again, I think we face the same challenge in the Senate. If the filibuster remains in place, I think it will be almost impossible to get 10 Republicans to support it. If the filibuster is eliminated, or if there's a carve out, exception created that relates to democracy and voting, et cetera, then it would seem like HR 51 would also come within that exception. So I'm hoping they do that in the Senate. We'll pass that out of the House for sure.
Great. I've got a few questions coming through in the chat. The census report, that's now under Secretary Raimondo, right?
Yes, I think the report, the preliminary numbers are expected to be given out at the end of, I think it's earlier than that. I want to say the end of April for the preliminary numbers. And then I think in September for the actual districts is what they're saying. Right,
for redistricting. And is that when we learn whether we are going to lose a congressional seat?
That's right. And it is under the jurisdiction of the Department of Commerce, where Secretary Raimondo now works.
Okay. I'm looking in the chat. Elimination of sub-minimum wage for workers with disabilities. This fell victim to being in the same section as, the $15 minimum wage for the CARES Act. Do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I think you'll see us pass those provisions along with the $15 minimum wage separately and send it to the Senate. This, as you know, the Senate parliamentarian ruled that couldn't be taken up under reconciliation. So it has to pass either in another bill or by itself. So, but I think we will pass it again with the provision that you just referenced in your question as well.
So the wages for the workers with people with developmental disabilities will be part of a minimum wage bill. Okay, thank you. Any movement on student loan forgiveness?
Annie might have I'm trying to remember the American Rescue Plan. I know there's the president is doing 2 recovery packages. One that is outlined on the infrastructure workforce development, all the issues I just described. I think the next bill is going to be about childcare, student loan forgiveness. So that'll be in the second package the president put forth. I think there was something, if Annie might remember, that was in the American Rescue Plan, although I don't know for certain.
Sorry, I can just interject. So he had passed an executive order which left out the interest accumulation and didn't require folks to pay, and he extended that through the end of September. And then there was in the American Rescue Plan funding included to go to institutions of higher education as well.
Great. Thanks, Annie.
Thank you. Probably we've touched on this with the IRS. I suspect you'll have a similar answer for what's going on with the Postal Service.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge challenge. You know, we saw Mr. DeJoy attempt to, make it more difficult for people to cast their ballots by mail and put in place a set of practices that really diminish the timeliness of the U.S. Postal Service. It is a beloved institution in this country, really important to small businesses, really important to seniors and veterans for the delivery of their prescription drugs. And I think you will continue to see Democrats fighting to provide additional resources to protect service to the post office. But unfortunately, I think Mr. DeJoy has a term, so I'm not sure he can be removed. But we have a leader there who sadly is, I think, doing a lot to try to undermine the effectiveness of the post office.
So you have to kind of work around him.
Yeah.
I suppose.
Which we can.
Okay. I have a hand raised from Ted Peets, my friend Ted. You have the floor, Ted.
Thank you. I guess I'm just revisiting the infrastructure bill and the American Rescue Plan Act. And as we all know, the money that's being proposed is more than once in a generation opportunity. It really is the opportunity of the 21st century. I mean, this amount of money is enormous. And as you may know, reliable broadband has been an ongoing sore spot for your constituents in the East Bay of Rhode Island. In fact, things have been so bad that recently the Portsmouth Times on their front page discussed an ongoing internet outage that took pretty much all of Portsmouth offline. So I guess one of my first question is the FCC has now revisited the definition of broadband, proposing that to be considered broadband, it'd be 100 megabits per second download and 100 upload. And in other words, symmetrical speeds. And when we're talking about the amount of dollars that we are considering investing, it would behoove us to invest in the technology that could support the network of today, tomorrow, and the next century, for the rest of the 21st century. If we're investing in technology that's only a Band-Aid, it's almost like a waste of that money or that generational opportunity. And now to my real question. So many folks are working very hard on building out the last mile fiber or plan to do that in the East Bay. And as our congressman, can you provide guidance for the American Rescue Plan Act for funding will come more at the state level, or do you envision that money going down to the local level, or what's the best strategy that if we really want to solve this problem once and for all, how to approach these federal dollars?
And I just missed what the problem that you're trying to solve.
Well, the problem really is that the lack of reliable broadband.
Okay, you're referring back to broadband. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one is there are resources that, we just brought $1.7 billion to the state of Rhode Island in state and local government fiscal recovery funds. That is money that can be used for broadband. So I think you have some combination of a state investment and local investment. That judgment will have to be made by local and city officials, town and city officials, as well as the governor and the state government. But there's a significant down payment in the American Rescue Plan available in funding of the $1.7 billion. In addition, there's additional money that was allocated or that's in the president's infrastructure plan to make sure there's universal access to broadband. So I think you can expect a big and serious investment in broadband in the infrastructure bill. So, I mean, I think a judgment will have to be made of, you know, do you do this in phases? Do you do some of it with the American Rescue Plan money? Do you do, and then the balance of it with federal funding that becomes available through the infrastructure bill? We also have a new mechanism, community project funding, which is equivalent to an earmark, which we finally brought back, that communities can apply for, where we can fight for specific money to go for a specific project if it's not covered by the current grant program or the American Rescue Plan or the infrastructure bill. But I think the intention of the president, if you read the language of the framework, is to deliver universal broadband. So that's a big undertaking, and it's going to require a lot of federal resources. But all of what has been provided in the fiscal recovery funds, broadband is an eligible expenditure.
I hope that answers your question, Ted. I think John Brooks was waving his hand. You need to unmute.
Unmute.
There you go.
There you are.
There we
Welcome,
are.
John.
Hey, David. Hi, Terry.
Hey,
Question,
John, how are you?
as well as I've ever been, and better when the bride Elizabeth is with me, as you know. So
Yes.
anyway, the question is at a federal level and at a state level, mental health, SAMHSA funding, and the integration of community health. We have 42 in the state. Your Uncle Bud is obviously well known for his participation here in Newport. But is there anything in this bill that will more specifically align the forces within Connecticut? I asked Lou DePalma the question, and he really, I don't know if Lou's on the call, I didn't see him. How do we pull the conceptual pieces together of both the funding that will theoretically go through SAMHSA back into the community health organization so that we can build a stronger platform within Rhode Island? And there's an integration between both the federal and the state level.
Yeah, I mean, I will be honest with you, that's beyond my expertise. I think, that the discussion has to be led by mental health professionals. But, we fought for the resources, as I mentioned earlier, $3.8 billion for mental health treatment and substance abuse treatment, $7.8 billion for community health centers, including community mental health centers. So there's a significant investment in the American Rescue Plan for the mental health community. That money will go through, obviously, some of the SAMHSA and some of the other programs you described. But, I think you're right. There's got to be greater coordination between state and local governments and, building a kind of structure. But I don't have expertise in that at all. And I think that discussion has to be led by the mental health leadership in our state.
I think Annie's got pretty good expertise, and so does Chris. So you may be selling yourself a hair short.
No, I mean, we have opinions about it for sure. But, I do think, look, this is a lot of resources, but that doesn't mean people shouldn't be using it in a very strategic and a thoughtful way and figuring out how do you maximize the benefit for Rhode Islanders, and having a strongly aligned federal and state and local effort obviously is central to that. But again, I just think that there are a lot of people who do this work who have real expertise that I just don't have.
Okay, so we'll defer to you, Terry and Marvin.
I was going to say, John, maybe we could talk about that offline.
No problem. All set. Thank you.
Okay. Great.
Mute me.
Tell Elizabeth I said hello.
So does anybody else have any other questions before we close for this evening? I'm so glad you could all join us. And again, I'm very grateful for your time this evening, Congressman.
Oh, my pleasure.
Anybody, any other questions? I don't see, let me just double check the chat. I think we've covered everything. We've covered a lot of ground this evening. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Good night, everyone.
Good night,
Well,
Congressman.
thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you so much.
Good night.
Thank you. Have a good night. Take care.